Okay, I think we're live. Hopefully you can hear me. I have no idea if you can. I may well just be talking to myself, but what the hell? Let's try it and see. Um, okay, that probably hurt your ears if this is working, but if it isn't working, then you didn't hear anything at all. You're just seeing a man with a very strange background speaking. Well, his lips are moving, but much like George H.W. Bush, the truth isn't coming out. And you'll remember that, well, some of us do, back in the 90s. But today I want to go back to the 70s because Pink Floyd are re-releasing a remastered and, redone, well, not redone, but just, cleaned up version of their most famous, or arguably their most famous concert film. And this is Pink Floyd Live at Pompeii, which originally came out around 1972. Now, this is an iconic film. And this really got me thinking about the visual impact of music more widely, because normally and nominally, music is something that only involves the ears in terms of our biology, but it really involves a lot more. It involves touch because sound waves create physical vibrations that can be felt, and well, the ears themselves work on very acute physical vibrations that are then translated into auditory information in the brain. Music can have a smell if you're seeing it live, even if not. A moldy record jacket does have a smell. But let's not get too esoteric. Let's talk about this interesting junction between the visual element of music and its more traditional sonic role. Now, music has always had a visual impact from day one, and in many ways, the modern era has retarded our ability to see music as a partly visual medium. And this is because recorded sound has the potential to isolate us from the look, the appearance of a live music performance. Before recorded music and before self playing instruments, which themselves have a bit more of a visual element anyway than recorded music, the only way you could hear music is if you could also see it, because you'd be watching someone or some people perform the music, or you'd be performing it yourselves. Now, I know some people are blind, some people are deaf. Stevie Wonder and Beethoven are some of my favorite musicians, but I think you get the idea. As music became more refined and more professionalized, it took on an ever more exacting and ever more precise visual accoutrement. And just as he was the man who invented modern orchestral conducting, so too did the great composer, author, Renaissance man Richard Wagner invent the way that we, even in 2025, think of the visual element of music. Because the way that he staged his operas relied on complex lighting schemes, really sophisticated set design, really interesting costumery, artificial smoke through dry ice, and the rest of it pumped into the auditorium. And Bayreuth, the opera house that became the home of Wagnerian opera, became one of the first opera houses, not the first, but one of the first to replace an already very sophisticated gas lighting system with electronic lights that gave you even more control over the lightness and darkness and the dimmers and all of that. So Wagner and his family at Bayreuth were very, very early pioneers in taking the visual element of musical presentation to a whole new level by using technology to help build the drama associated with an otherwise musical performance. The orchestra below and the singers on stage. Now, throughout the history of music going forward from Wagner's time, Wagner's shadow was looming large over people who wanted to do interesting things visually with music. Sometimes this was limited to costumes. As lighting got more sophisticated, there was that element as well. And then there was the element of using film and music. It's no coincidence that when Todd AO debuted its 70 millimeter film system, which accompanied a 6-channel discrete magnetic audio system, the first picture that they put out was not something that was dramatic and highly dialogue oriented or anything else. It was a musical. It was Rodgers and Hammerstein's Oklahoma. And many of the widescreen formats like Todd AO, Ultra Panavision, Super Panavision 70, a lot of the early releases on these formats were in fact musicals. Think of South Pacific, think of The Sound of Music, and many, many others. Hello, Dolly, even. And so this showed that this unity of high quality sound and high quality vision was very important to those producing content, which was ultimately driven by the music as much as anything else. Let's now look at Pink Floyd, because Pink Floyd were among the foremost early innovators in bringing unique visual elements to their musical performances. Maybe this was because half of them had studied architecture. Maybe that's because the others were sort of had a knowledge of the visual arts. But in any case, the liquid light shows, which involved overhead projectors, created those wonderful backlit backdrops that you would see in the early Sid Barrett videos. And Pink Floyd were always looking to pioneer the visual performance, because they'd be the first to tell you that, especially post Sid Barrett, they weren't the most interesting guys to look at on stage. They didn't really dance, they didn't really ever do the put your hands in the air type of thing. And so they used the visual element to compensate for that. And also, as the venues got bigger, and this is something from their own words, pardon me, they would use the visual element to communicate a message back to the back row of a giant football stadium, where even with the jumbotron, which came in by the end of the 70s, it wasn't the most personal experience. And we all know what this involved. It involved film screens, the big round Mr. Screen, where they would project unique films made specifically to accompany the music. The light shows got ever more sophisticated. There were balloons, then there were puppets, and then there was a wall, and all sorts of effects that went on with that, and lasers, and we all know the rest of it. Now, the Live in Pompeii film is interesting because, as Nick Mason himself admitted when talking about the re release of the film, the visual elements of it had nothing to do with the band. And this is very different than The Wall, very different than The Pig, very different than The Screen, where it was all internal to Pink Floyd. This was really the visual brainchild of a director called Adrian Marban. And he had the idea, let's take the band, plop them in an abandoned and empty audienceless amphitheater in the historic ancient city of Pompeii, and just have them play a set. And it worked really, really, really well. And this lends an argument to the fact that Pink Floyd's music itself, and I've said this before, has a distinctly and discreetly cinematic element, whereby, though, because the music is very much both narrative and romantically lyrical in the sense of 19th century poetry, because the music has a lot of breathing space, these sort of slow andante moving minor chords that rise and fall, build and sway, it lends itself to that, which might be why they were asked to do several soundtracks. There was the film More, there was a film Laval, which was the Obscured by Clouds soundtrack. There was the work that they did with Michelangelo Antonioni with Zabriskie Point, one of the weirdest films ever, but it's a right on, man, that type of era. But so they've always lent themselves to that. But I would say that with Live in Pompeii, they created, along with Adrian Marban, one of the most interesting and compelling live concert films ever. Now, the fact that there was no audience is one thing, but I think that it was really the editing and the camera angles that made it so unique. Adrian Marban made the most of being at this wonderful location without really milking it, because, yeah, you'd get some wide shots, but some of the most interesting shots were close ups where you could just sort of see some of the amphitheater in the background. So it wasn't as though he was trying to upstage the band with a sort of travel log of Pompeii. It was really as though this is this ancient piece of European art, and here this rock band is a sort of modern European art, and it just sort of really, really worked. Now, the visual element of modern music has been helped by technology without doubt, but there's more than one way to present something visual. Take the band Queen, who, along with Pink Floyd, were probably the two most visually interesting bands of the era. Now, they did it in very different ways. Yeah, as Queen got bigger and bigger, they had some really good light shows of their own, but their visual element was more about the person than the technology. It was all about this operatic vaudevillian commedia dell'arte type of frontman in Freddie Mercury, who held the crowd in the palm of his hand. He is one of the best entertainers ever. I mean, the greats of vaudeville and music hall could look at Freddie and tip their hats, even if they didn't really like modern rock music of the 70s and 80s, because they could probably see this guy is a top class entertainer who knows how to get any audience on his side. Then you had Parliament Funkadelic with their spaceship and their costumes and their light show, and ELO eventually got a spaceship of their own on their famous Out of the Blue tour. As you get into the 80s, of course, Pink Floyd with their wall shows, which they still haven't released the film of it. Obviously, there is a dramatic film made of it, but they did film the original concerts, but Roger doesn't seem to want to release them. Maybe he will someday. Um, Technology in the 80s was helped along by the computer with things like Very Light, the Very Light system, which was a computerized lighting system that allowed light designers to program so many interesting movements and combinations of light changes into their shows. And Genesis were one of the first bands to actually use it. I believe the first. By the end of the decade, everyone had a Very Light show because it just allowed you through early personal computer style technology to do so much with lights. Going back to the 70s, the guys who invented laserium were pioneers, using laser light to create wonderfully interesting visuals for bands that went on tour with them. And then they took the performances into planetariums in various cities across the world, whether it's Griffith Park or Madame Tussauds. There's so many of these other locations. Pink Floyd were a big part of that, as were so many other big bands throughout the 70s and 80s. And I just wish they'd bring it back because laserium was so fun. I've done a video on laserium itself, so do check that out if this is a subject of interest and or intrigue to you. I thought about this further and I thought, was there any artist who combined the sort of technical theatricality of Pink Floyd with the individual theatricality of Freddie Mercury? And that would be Michael Jackson, whose live shows in the 80s and 90s got increasingly sophisticated. Now, like Freddie Mercury, he is someone who could hold the audience in the palm of his hand from the beginning to the very end. We all know the famous sort of silent moment at the Super Bowl when he did the halftime show, when he just sort of stood there and let the tension build and build and build. Then he throws off his glasses, the show begins, and that entire audience, whether I think that would have been the Super Bowl where was it the one where the Giants played the Bills and wide right? I think it was that one, but correct me if I'm wrong. I think it was that one in the early 90s. I don't know, wide right. Yeah, maybe Michael Jackson is a curse in Buffalo. Who knows? Anyway, he was able to combine these two things. And from then on, so many other bands just sort of upped the ante, whether they had charismatic individuals in the band who could pull off the theatricality or not. But Pink Floyd was a huge pioneer in this. So back to Live at Pompeii. So this was originally filmed in 35 millimeter film. It was recorded. I don't even think they had 16 tracks. I think Steve Wilson, who remixed the audio, said that there were just 4 basic stems and a few overdubs. So the sound was really live with little room for manipulation. But I still think that Steve did a good job in remixing the sound. I don't frequently like remixes, but with this, there wasn't much he could do anyway. But he kept it very tasteful. But the EQ choices he made have definitely improved it without changing the aura. In terms of the film, they gave the negatives a really good cleaning, and they definitely used digital technology in post production to try to color match and just keep the color consistent. They might have gone overboard a bit, making the colors way more vivid than they probably were, even when the negatives were brand new. Most audiences, though, I think will like it because it makes it look as though it were filmed in almost 70 millimeter or in 4K. And many of you who have seen it cinematically will know that IMAX, digital IMAX, is playing it, and digital IMAX is, of course, meant to replicate the visual pristine look of the original horizontal 70 millimeter IMAX. And I do think they've done a very good job. This was always a film that was really meant for the big screen, but they've uploaded clips to YouTube, and I have a feeling once the cinematic run is done, it will be all over the rest of YouTube for the rest of you and me. Um, I just love the film because, like I said, the tracking shots of the back of the amplifiers, the going overboard with Nick Mason on the One of These Days clips, David Gilmour's hair doing battle with his mouth during Saucer Full of Secrets, the shots of them walking around during Echoes. It created stuff that is so iconic that many music videos have parodied it. I don't know if Weird Al has parodied it from a visual point of view. I hope he does, because again, even if you're not really a fan of Pink Floyd, somewhere down the line, you will have been familiar with some of these images from Live in Pompeii. And most of all, it's just a great musical performance. It shows that whether in youth or in age, the guys in Pink Floyd just knew how to play live really, really well. They weren't into sort of outlandishly long solos on the keyboards. Dave Gilmour's guitar solos were very much a part of a melody line, but they put on such a good show. And you can really see that for all of the hustle and bustle and the lawsuits, at that time, they were a band of four members, each doing an equally important thing. Rick setting the entire tone for everything with his keyboards that, while subtle, they make the Pink Floyd sound. Gilmour's guitar, everyone knows and loves. Roger Waters' presence is just larger than life, even when he was incredibly slim. And Nick Mason was a very central part, not only of the visual elements of the film, but of the music. And I think that this film shows all of that very vividly and very well. So maybe the microphone didn't work and you couldn't hear a damn thing. If that's the case, I do sincerely apologize. But if you did hear me, remember to like, subscribe, and as always, we'll see you next time. Take care.